Hello and welcome. It's Cheryl here from senseofwhimsy.com.au. I'm creating a card today using the Stampin Up Happiness Abounds stamp set and die bundle. It's traditionally a gorgeous fine line floral bundle, but today I'm going to create a card that doesn't use any flowers. It just has these gorgeous leaves and features the little background stamp from the die set. We're going to be using some watercolouring techniques and also a gold embossed splatter technique. Ink colours I'm using are Orchid Oasis, Old Olive, Tahitian Tide and Starry Sky. This is the Happiness Abounds bundle and the Blossoming Happiness die set. Cardstock wise, we'll be using a folded Starry Sky card with a plain white insert. I've got a Tahitian Tide layer, another basic white layer, and then I've got some Fluid 100 watercolour paper and a sheet of the Layering Designs vellum, and I'm using a white pattern. I've got the Blossoming Happiness dies, and this is that background die I was talking about. I'm just going to die cut that down in the left hand corner, and as you can see it cuts out a lot of very small hearts and leaf shapes. So I'm just going to grab my die brush and we'll take as many of these little bits out as we can, and then once that's done we'll discard all of the little waste pieces, and this is what you're left with. Now you can see that some of the leaves haven't come out. Now that's because they're still attached and that's how they're meant to be. I'm going to use my Take Your Pick tool in fast motion to just push those towards the front of the card. That raises them up and gives the card just that additional little bit of texture as all the leaves sit up from the front of the card. That's going to go on the Tahitian Tide layer, and the Tahitian Tide colour will show through all these little die cut pieces. I'm using my liquid glue to adhere this panel to the card front. It's a little easy with the liquid glue, but you could use either your snail or glue dots if you use glue dots, however you normally adhere your layers to your card front. And that's on with a nice border around the edge. We'll pop that aside to put on the front of the card a bit later. I've got my Fluid 100 watercolour paper and I'm just going to stamp the double leaf from the stamp set. I'm going to stamp that in the 4 different colours. So we'll start with the Orchid Oasis. Now I'll do one for the front of the card, and I'll also do another one for the inside of the card while I'm doing my stamping and colouring. I will need to clean my stamp off in between because the colours are quite different. The green is the Old Olive, and I'll need a couple for the front of the card, and I'll also need one for the inside of the card as well. Now I've just realised that I'm not going to fit all my leaves on this panel. Luckily I have another scrap handy here. We'll put one Tahitian Tide on this panel, and then I'll grab another scrap of Fluid 100 watercolour paper to finish off these leaves. That's one more Tahitian Tide for the inside of the card. And then last of all we've got Starry Sky, and we'll just need one for the front of the card in the Starry Sky. So now we're going to go ahead and watercolour those leaves. So I'll take each of the ink colours I've just used and pop some on either end of the block. This is going to be my palette for my watercolouring. So I've got the Orchid Oasis, the Old Olive, the Tahitian Tide, and lastly the Starry Sky. That's quite a dark ink. Now I've got my water brush, and we'll start with the Tahitian Tide. So I'm going to add some water to the ink on the block, and it's quite runny. We'll need maybe a little bit of paper towel is going to help here. So we'll grab that and just take any excess off onto the paper towel. Now I'm going to colour these leaves, and originally I was just going to colour them and leave the white edges, but then I decided to take the colour outside the lines so that when I die cut the leaves there won't be a white edge, it'll be colour all the way to the edge of the die. So I'm just roughly colouring that. I do want a little bit of texture, so I'm not particularly too worried if it's splattery. In fact, the more texture there is. I'm going to add a little bit of depth to the stem part of the leaves. We'll add a little bit more onto here, and that's just, this is quite runny, so that's just a matter of dabbing the ink colour on, and it will naturally blend out as it dries. That looks pretty good. Okay, and then we'll move on to the next colour. So I'll just clean my brush off on this paper towel, and then we'll do the old olive leaves. So again, adding some water, taking the excess off, and then just starting at the base. I'll add some to each base to start with, and then we'll just take the colour out to the edges, and again outside the lines. This is my type of colouring outside the lines. Okay, and again I'll just add some more intense colour at the base of the leaves. And there we go. They look a bit blotchy, but they will dry quite nicely. Gives you a little bit of a watercolour look. Next up, we'll do the Orchid Oasis. That's the next darkest colour. It's a sort of a bluey purple colour. This one's quite light, so we'll add quite a bit of colour at the base here. Looks messy, but it will look good once they're die cut. Last one is just this Starry Sky leaf. I've got way too much ink on this block for this poor one little leaf. And once you spread that colour out, it's amazing what different shades you can get when you watercolour. You can see there's a quite light bluey colour, and then adding the more intense colour at the stem. I might just add a little bit more of the Orchid Oasis to the base of these leaves here. Now they do look a bit wet, but we are going to dry those off with the heat tool. So that's just drying them until they're dry to the touch. These are all dry now, so I'm going to now add my splatter. Now this is a technique I picked up from the amazing Tammy Hewlett. There's just a little bit of liquid glue on a block, and then I've got an old paintbrush here, which I'm going to add some water to that glue to make it quite runny. And that's what we're actually going to splatter with that paintbrush. So mix it up well, make sure it's quite runny, and then I'll have my gold embossing powder ready. I have mine in a little container, and I will go over my leaves with my embossing buddy. So pick some of that gluey mess up with your paintbrush, and then just tap it over the pieces. We're just looking for random dots, but you will need to make sure that you do get some dots in the actual leaves. That looks pretty good, and we'll do these other two as well. And that's looking pretty good. Okay, stop now, Cheryl. We'll pop that aside, and I'll bring in my gold embossing powder. And normally I just dip that straight into the powder, but because this is quite runny, I don't want it to run, so I'm actually going to dump the powder on top with this little spoon. And then once you tap it off, the powder has stuck to all of the little splatters. And it's the glue mixed with the water that helps it do that. So that's all of our leaves done. And it's way easier to do this before we go ahead and die cut. So I am going to now heat that embossing powder so it melts. And there you can see it going gold. It does bubble a little bit. I think that's because it's quite liquid with the glue in it. But it will dry as a lovely gold splatter. Doesn't that look amazing? It's fabulous, and it sits up high, so it's got some really lovely texture to it. So we'll go ahead and do all of that embossing on the leaves. They look amazing. And then I'm going to die cut them. So there's this little die for the 2 leaves. Just make sure they're nice and dry before you run them through your Stampin' Cut and Emboss machine. And you will end up with all of these gorgeous little gold splattered watercoloured leaves. Love them. Now I've got my piece of layering designs vellum in one of the white designs, and these are the Forever Flourishing dies. I'm going to use this little dual leaf just to die cut some leaves. I'll do 3, and then because I'm going to cut these in half, I'll end up with 6 leaves to go on my card front. So that's those done. We'll also need a sentiment. So I've just chosen one of the sentiments from the Happiness Abounds stamp set. This one reads, "Sending many thanks for all you do," but all of the sentiments are quite gorgeous. I'm stamping that with Starry Sky, just onto a scrap of basic white cardstock. And then I'm going to pull in the Blossoming Happiness dies, and there is these 2 border or edge dies. One is little square holes and the other one is like a spiral bind type hole. So this line here is what cuts, so that's what you want to go towards the bottom. So we'll just line that up underneath the sentiment and go ahead and die cut that. And then once it's die cut, we'll need to trim it down. And I'm going to trim it a little closer to the top of the sentiment as well. I'm using my Stampin' trimmer, and this trimmer actually will cut quite fine little slivers when you need it to. So as long as you can make sure that it's held in place, and I'm lining it up with the grid lines on the trimmer, and I'm just going to start from the bottom and come up and trim that one little sliver off so that I've got a nice straight edge quite close to the top of the sentiment. I'm using my paper snips to trim this up on the diagonal on each end. Until you have a nicely spaced sentiment. Now I actually filmed this bit beforehand and forgot to have the video on, but I added a blue Tahitian Tide splatter just with my Stampin' Right marker by flicking the brush end into the lid and then onto the card. That just gives you a lovely fine splatter over the entire card front. I'm applying this layer, all of these layers now, to the front of my Starry Sky folded card. And now we're ready to add the sentiment, which I'm going to back with some of the fine white fray ribbon, I think it's called. I've cut it to the length I want and then frayed the ends and then cut it on the diagonal. Now I'll show you how easy that is. This is called frayed ribbon because it frays so well. You just pull the end and it comes away till you have the right amount of fray that you need. And then I just layered it on top and manually trimmed the ends with my paper snips. I keep a separate pair of snips for ribbon so it's always nice and sharp. And then that's ready to go onto the back of the sentiment. So I'm going to use some of the Seal Plus to adhere these together. That gives it will give it a nice strong bond. So I'll just apply the Seal Plus to the back of the sentiment and then place that onto the ribbon. Just so it shows a little bit along the top and so the 2 frayed edges just sit out from the diagonal edge. That's going to sit on my card front like this, and then all of my leaves will come out from behind that sentiment. So I'll just go ahead and place them all where I think they should go. So we'll do a little cluster to the bottom left of the sentiment, and then just a couple of leaves at the top right of the sentiment. That's 4 along the bottom, and then I've just got the 1 vellum leaf at the top, and then with the coloured leaves I'm going to use 2 green 1 Tahitian tide, so 2 old olive, 1 Tahitian tide, 1 starry sky and 1 orchid oasis. And then the other leftover leaves will go on the inside of the card. So we'll just place these until you get them roughly where you want them. We'll pop, that one's the starry sky leaf, and the vellum leaves will be tucked in behind. And they'll sit something like that. So I'm going to go ahead and adhere those leaves now with some mini glue dots. So I'm going to continuously refer to, pull the sentiment back in so I can refresh my memory as to where I wanted things to be. But the mini glue dots, I'm going to put at least 2 onto each vellum leaf. They'll also be held down with the other leaves, so 2 at the base should be fine. It's going to sit there, so the other leaves will go over the top, and for my leaves I'll use 2 or 3 glue dots on the back of each leaf. So we'll do 1 at the base and then 1 a little bit further up each leaf, and then that will not only hold this leaf down, but it'll also help hold the vellum leaf down underneath. So that's one of the old orchid leaves. This one's the starry sky, and I'll apply that in the same way. Now once I've popped these on, I continuously check that I'm putting them in the right place by bringing my sentiment piece back in, and we'll go ahead and do the remainder of the leaves. Now I'm going to put this on fast forward so that it doesn't take quite so long. So again, it's just 2. I usually use 2 so that the leaf doesn't swivel. Again, just checking I'm getting my placement correct. And we'll pop that one down there. These vellum leaves are fabulous because they give a little bit of depth behind the coloured leaves, but they don't take away in any way from the beautiful watercoloured and gold splattered leaves. But they definitely give it a feeling of fullness. And then the other leaves, again 3 glue dots. So we've got the old olive leaf. We'll do this one's the orchid oasis leaf, very similar to the starry sky. It's just slightly more purple, but very similar once you watercolor with them. And then the last one is the Tahitian tide. And there we go. Now the sentiment itself will go up on Stampin' Dimensionals, so that will be lifted up. Now again, I'll put this on fast forward, and we'll stick the dimensionals. I put quite a few on, especially because we're using ribbon and I really want it to stick fast. And then that can just pop down in place. Beautiful. And then the very last thing is to add some of these gorgeous matte dots. Now these are in the 2022-2024 in colours, and any of these would work. So we've got Tahitian Tide, Starry Sky and Orchid Oasis. I'm going to use the Orchid Oasis. They do come in an ombre type effect, so you can choose whichever ones you want to use. I'll use a couple of the larger size and then a few more of the smaller size. So I like to sort of group them. And we'll put one more. We better have another one because I need to have that's 6, and I need odd number, so we'll put the last one. Where will we put the last one? I think down here. And that's the front of the card finished. Now I did go ahead and do an insert for this card as well, just using similar elements to what I've used on the front of the card. So let me show you that. You can see I've got the background die, those leaves that I did extra, and the extra vellum leaves. I hope you've enjoyed this card today. If you have any questions at all, please don't hesitate to be in touch. My email is listed above, or you can leave a comment below. If you would like the supplies that I've used and the measurements for this card, I've put them in both imperial and metric on my blog, and the link is in the description below. Bye.